Everybody that has joined us. I'm Zach Hendricks. I'm the Long Range Planning and Climate Action Assistant with Community Development. We have Cindy Hubin, our Community Development Director, Ellen Sassana, who is our Long Range Planner, and then Chad Abrams, I always screw up your name, sorry Chad, is with us as well today. He is the Code Enforcement Officer for Community Development, but he has kindly offered to take notes for us today so that we can make sure we're recording everybody's comments. So before we get started, I'm just going to cover some quick logistics. Many of you have seen this a couple times already, but just to make sure we're getting it covered. So again, to get to our website, if you go to pitkincounty.com, scroll down, you'll see the Planning, Zoning, and Building button. If you click on that, that'll take you to the Community Development webpage. There'll be a big purple button in the middle. It says Growth Management Public Outreach Information. Click on that. And that will take you to our main webpage for this process. You'll have all the meeting dates. You'll have the webinar join, how to get to the YouTube. The citizen input is down here at the bottom as well that we've gotten thus far. And then we have the categories with the relevant information. You'll see in the community benefits, I've added the tables that we did last week. And so that is in there as well. And then I also want to point out, because affordable housing has come up quite frequently, we also have included the Greater Roaring Fork Regional Housing Study that was done by APSHA relating to affordable housing. And then we also have the meeting recordings from all of them. So if you ever want to go back and watch last week or jump to a particular moment, hear a particular comment, that is available there as well. On the citizen input, we are always accepting it. So if you would like to submit citizen input and have it included, please just send an email to Ellen or I. You can see our emails are down here at the bottom of the page as well. And so if you just send that there, and then you can indicate if you want it to be shared with the group or not in that email. And if you do, we can include it on our webpage for you. Okay. Real quick, before I bounce it over to Ellen, I just want to go over, we have an agenda for today as well. So as you see, we just did the technical overview and logistics. Ellen and Cindy will be taking what we're hoping to accomplish today. We'll be prioritizing the benefits that we heard last week, and then we have a few outstanding questions that we wish to cover. When we get to the discussion, so after we finish what we want to accomplish today, I'm going to do the same process that we did last week, where I promote all of you in to be panelists. So you'll have that ability to mute and unmute yourself. Please just be respectful of each other when each other is talking so that we can make sure everyone's being heard. But you will be able to mute and unmute yourself. You won't have to rely on me to give you that authority. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellen and Cindy. You're muted, Cindy.
Thanks. Really quickly, I was going to do what Zach just did, walk through the agenda, but today, just the purpose is to look back at what we did last time. We sent you in the packet how we took notes and prioritized what you said about benefits. Ellen will go over that. And then we're going to cover some questions that we thought were outstanding that we didn't get to last time. And then I wrote a little narrative, elevator speech, if you will, that helps put growth management in today's context, I hope. And then there are questions that go along with that to spark some discussion that will lead us into how we start to look at the specifics in the growth management system. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Ellen with priorities.
Okay, thanks. So at the last meeting, we started to refine the community attributes that need to be addressed to ensure the growth is managed to continue to result in a desirable community and quality of life looking forward. This list is what we think we heard in terms of community needs and priorities. We're not going to spend much time today delving into the details of the list, but just want to know if we generally got it right. So carrying capacity was at the top of the list. We added several categories that aren't currently addressed in the land use code, including under the infrastructure facilities category, schools, landfill, public health, human resources, communications technology, trails, recreational capacity, among several that you see here. But those are some of the newer topics that got added. Under the environment relating to carrying capacity, several of those topics are already addressed in the land use code, but remain relevant. Climate action relates somewhat to carrying capacity and is critically important to the community. While some of the attributes listed here are gaining traction already in our land use code and the energy code, there's much work to be done here for sure. And there's some new topic areas that were identified last week, including electrification. The term regenerative land use practices was added to the mix. There was some discussion about embodied energy of development, the life cycle of materials and how important that is to consider. And then addressing the impacts of redevelopment, which has really become something we need to focus on more and more because it is more prevalent day to day. So the concept of community, these attributes have not changed over the years, but continue to be guiding foundational elements of the community here. And they are addressed to some extent already in the land use code, but need to be carried forward. They include community character, spirit of place, preserving historic buildings, arts and culture are key elements. Preserving open space, public lands, and wildlife continues to be critical, and promotion of local agriculture has and continues to be really important. Affordable housing is not a new issue and continues to be a pressing need. And we won't go into much detail there today, but clearly something we need to work on. Residential use needs to be addressed in its many iterations as it has morphed from its traditional definition. We've always had year-round occupancy and second homes. Part-time occupancy is a part of the mix, but short-term rentals, commercial, residential, and taxing implications of all of these residential uses are all new things that need to be looked at, new or relatively new, I should say. So economy is clearly an important component of community, and several concepts have been identified as worthy of consideration, including world-class tourist economy, which has always been something we've considered, but through the lens of climate change is a change that's become relevant in the last decades. Exploring a steady state economy, that's something that was raised as an issue to look at. The term regenerative economy was brought into the mix, and something we should be looking at. And promoting locally owned and serving businesses is something we've looked at continually and need to continue to focus on. And looking at locally housed employees instead of commuter employees, again, is something we've talked about, but need to continue to focus on. And then local food production and organic farming, again, is something we've talked about in the past, but need to continue to look at as part of the fabric of a resilient economy. So socioeconomic equity is certainly nothing new, but something that needs to be further defined and addressed. I'm not going to try to delve into that today. There were several wild cards in addition to those topics that didn't really fit well into a specific category, including the possibilities and impacts of telecommuting on the economy, transportation, land use patterns, and demographics of the county. Looking at the dimensions and dynamics of the pandemic. That's certainly something that's new to the world and something that we need to consider. And then looking at pacing objectives for growth in the county. Again, pacing is something that's always been a component or intended to be a component of growth management. But it's lost its way in the last decade or so. We've really lost our focus on pacing. So it's something that needs to be considered moving forward. So these are the attributes we think floated to the top as priorities. And we're looking to you for some feedback on whether we got it right. Is there anything we completely missed or misstated? Again, this isn't really going to be the main focus of today's discussion, but we do want to make, because these are so important moving forward, we want to make sure that we got them right. So with that, unless Cindy or Zach have anything to add to this list, it'd be great to hear back from you.
Yeah, so I'm going to promote everybody in so that you're able to talk freely. So just give us a second for you to be able to join up properly, and then we can start the discussion.
Let's see. And Zach, let us know if everybody has been promoted and can participate. We'll give it a few minutes to see if anybody has questions, comments, and if not, then we can just we'll move into the next segment.
So everybody who just had a notification saying it either said I or Bonnie Shiles did it, you should be able to mute and unmute yourself freely now. Please feel free to comment. And then I believe the phone number we have is Jeffrey Woodruff. I've also allowed you to talk as well. So if you wish to comment, you can as well.
This is Cindy. I'll just say that this list of priorities that we put together based on the comments we've had so far, we will use these when we're looking at, the development of our, whatever the growth management type system is going to look like. So if there's something that we missed, or if you feel like the priorities are a little out of sequence, or if you feel strongly that something's here but shouldn't be here, those are the kinds of questions that we're asking right now, so that we know that this will be a foundational piece for us moving forward. And we want to make sure that there's consensus on that.
And again, you should be able to mute or unmute yourself if you're not familiar with Zoom. If you scroll over your controls, there should be a little microphone key that allows you to unmute yourself. So please feel free to just comment.
Hey guys, this is Chris. List looks great to me. Seems to capture what, I felt like I contributed and was also hearing from folks. Nothing to add.
Thank you. And just so people know that some people text me if they say, hey, I can't speak, or I can't get on, or whatever. Just so you know, I don't have my phones with me. Left them at home.
Well, we can also move on if we got it right, glad to hear it. And if somewhere down the line in our discussion today, something dawns on you, feel free, we can always come back to this document. So yeah, I'm hoping that we did get it right. We took some time in trying to work through all of the details of what we heard. So maybe we're in good shape here. And Cindy, were you?
I think Zach's up next with outstanding questions.
Yep.
Thanks.
Let's pull them up quick.
Yeah, there were some questions last week that we didn't feel like we really got to discuss. So hopefully we'll have some discussion around these questions.
So the first question that we felt like we needed to address that we didn't quite get to were the different requirements for residential and commercial as it currently exists. As you'll see, the second question will be whether we want to create another category as well. But currently in the commercial design requirements, the commercial requirements for growth management are requirements for site design. So this includes vegetation, where the vegetation should go, orientation of the building. We do have orientation standards in our land use code currently, but they're not requirements, they're guidelines. So they have to show if they can or cannot meet them. We could theoretically make them requirements in the growth management. Is that something that we wish to do? Also in the commercial, that's not included in the residential, is parking and circulation. So we've had the discussions about how some of these larger homes are being used as VRBOs. Do we want them to have to address the parking that might be associated with such a use? So those are some of the questions we had, but it also goes vice versa. Do we want the commercial land uses to also have to meet the same standards that the residential are providing as well? So that was our first outstanding question. If anybody has any thoughts on that, please feel free to comment. Well, wait, just so I can illustrate, I can also pull up what those were so you can see as well.
Zach, can I ask a question while you're doing that? If short-term rentals would have to like address parking, how would that change from the current situation, and what would that look like?
I think it would probably be, and please feel free to correct me, Cindy or Alan, but I imagine it would be some sort of like parking plan associated with the parcel itself to ensure that they're not exploding out onto a county road. Maybe they have to construct extra additional parking spaces on the lot itself to address that larger capacity of use. So I imagine it'd be something like that. I don't know if it'd be super specific. If we say if we want them to do it, we might leave it open so there's some creativity for how they address those parking impacts as well.
I think also just more, in line with the fire codes, for some of the driveway access. It's an issue right now. Once you get that past 3 homes off of a road, then the access needs to be wider for the fire district. And we have some conflicts with character in the rural areas based on needs of the fire district in order to get the equipment to serve the homes. So we have some character issues relative to the width of some of the driveway accesses due to the number of homes, but then also when the fire district looks at being able to respond to a home, they need a certain distance to areas of the house to be able to reach with their equipment. So it gets tricky and it begins to, consume a lot of area that I think character-wise then takes away from some of the rural area characteristics.
But then, Chris, on the screen now, you can see some of the details of what is included under the current commercial parking and circulation standard in growth management.
Right, and snow storage has always been an issue as well. Because if you
Thanks,
don't,
guys. Yeah, and I'm kind of wondering, I mean, like, if there were a change for short-term rental, I mean, like, at what point in someone's process does that come up? Does, you know, if there's an existing structure that becomes a short-term rental, is your question like, does that then trigger, you know, analysis of parking requirements? Or are you talking about asking people to consider whether they want to short-term rent before they build or remodel and having that impact something?
I think personally, I mean, I think there's some openness to how that process would work. We probably have to do some serious thinking about it, but at the approval of a project, there would be many of the houses get covenants put on them already. So it could be something where there's a covenant that if this is used as a VRBO, additional conditions are triggered then for that use. So if they decide to use it as a VRBO, then they have to address those conditions listed in the covenant. And that would kind of keep it that open long-term. Existing stock, I don't know that there would be a way to address that if they haven't gone through the growth management system that we end up with.
we don't have a short-term rental system now, and we are looking at that because many of the homes are being used that way. So obviously there are different impacts from that than just a normal family life or even a second home occasional use. So Chris, it's all a new world to us. So those are great questions, and I've captured them. Maybe in certain areas with existing homes, we'll have to look at, you know, what would the site plan allow from a capacity perspective for parking, and maybe there's a limitation on the number of visitors or renters or short-term renters. Based on that, maybe there's a distance from the core equation. You know, those are all great questions.
But also in terms of when we consider these issues in the process, don't know. I don't, you know, they could be just standards in regulations in the land use code, or perhaps they could be wrapped into some sort of growth management criteria that needs to be addressed, yet to be determined in terms of when we would apply these criteria.
Yeah, we were thinking about these standards or these criteria, but it brings up the question as to whether or not, you know, it's the next question really on our list. Do things have different criteria based on their type of use? If a residence is used as a commercial short-term versus a second home versus a full-time. And, you know, when do we know that? And does that stay stagnant? Is there some sort of change in use that would trigger other types of provisions for safety requirements or community requirements? So, and is that part of growth management, or is that a standard? So those are all pretty open questions at this point.
So maybe since you're asking the question, we should move on to that one for now, and we can come back to the first one maybe after we've answered the second one. So as Cindy just said, do we want different benefits from different types of uses? As we've mentioned, there's currently two types, residential and commercial. Do we want to create a category that is a residential commercial mix? So if they're using it part-time as a residence and the other time as a VRBO, which is a commercial use, do we want to get different benefits from that kind of development? Do we want primary residences to give different benefits than second homes? These are all things that we could potentially do. It's just assessing how many categories do we want? what's the difference between them all.
If any of you deal with short-term rentals or property management, you probably have more experience than we do as far as what the impacts are. I talked to someone yesterday who is sort of a coordinator for a family who has several residences, and she was telling me about, you know, how right now anyway, there's such a demand for turnover in these units that are being used by family members and friends, that there's a huge demand for services. You know, who's going to go in and rearrange the beds, or who's going to go in and clean and get cars to the airport for people when they're getting off the planes. And so that kind of thing has created a lot maybe more intensity recently because of the higher turnover use. But I'm not really sure what that means as far as the site itself and things that we want to look at, other than the frequency of maintenance.
And I do want to just say, everybody, you have been given the ability to mute and unmute yourself. So any thoughts, any comments on this, please feel free to just jump in. Yeah, just unmute yourself and feel free to let loose.
So this is Phi, and I think with short-term rentals, just I see it, you know, across the country with the, you know, increase, but especially, you know, in areas like here, and obviously you're seeing a huge uptick in Pitkin County, it becoming almost having to be managed similar to an affordable housing standard, you know, where there's certain requirements, and because you obviously a building, when a house is built, you don't know how it will be used throughout its lifetime. And so I feel like it's something that's going to have its own standards and triggers when you become a short-term rental, and that enters into this nebulous or maybe a new designation of commercial residential that has its own requirements and things. But I'm with Cindy. I don't know that is part of growth management. I don't know if it's something that can be managed in growth management.
Right, and we don't have a lot of direction from our master plans, our neighborhood master plans,
Yeah.
you know, on that either, but those are good things to think about. Yeah.
And I'm sure you already are with what you're working on, but yeah.
Suzanne, did you have something you want to say?
Yes. Are you all getting any feedback from neighborhoods, either condominium complexes or other more traditional neighborhoods, about what they are seeing right now, what the impacts are on them of something going short term?
It's all that I've gotten has been anecdotal. There hasn't been any formal caucus or survey work or anything like that done, but that's a good piece of data that maybe we could ask the caucuses to let us know if they have any feedback they want to give us on that. We've invited the caucuses to be here, but I don't think we have any representatives today. I'm not sure. Maybe we keep getting people jumping on, so I'm not sure. But if there's anybody that's representing a caucus here today, maybe they would let us know what they're thinking. Suzanne, that's a great idea. I think we should send out a request to ask if there's any impacts anybody would like to.
Yeah, I'd like to see that.
So I just facilitated the group for the neighborhood that I live in to look at short-term rentals and regulations. And what we discovered is that there's a lot of, like you said, anecdotal issues. You know, my neighbors rent their house and the people are partying all night, or, you know, they're incredibly rude, or they're parking on the street and all these things. And what we really realized is that we just didn't have the data You can call your HOA, but of course there's nobody there at 10 o'clock at night. And then all of a sudden it becomes, everybody was like, we need to fine, and we need there to be fines and these types of regulations and punitive steps that can be taken if there's a rental, that there's an issue. But of course the HOA person comes in the morning and the incident is over, and all of a sudden it's he said, she said, and you have the owner of the property someplace else who's saying, well, I talked to the renter and they said they weren't being noisy at all. The homeowner next door was being, really unreasonable. So, how do you manage that in the neighborhood? And so a couple of things that we decided to do, and this is for the ranch at the Roaring Fork. The first couple steps were that if you were going to short-term rent your home, you had to register it with the HOA, and we're going to create just an on-site, very easy registration. And so at least we have records of who's doing short-term rentals on the property. And then we're going to create a database, an easy way for people to start to enter complaints, so we can at least get a sense of what we're seeing. And is it the same house consistently? Is it, how big a problem is this? So those are some of the just really initial steps being taken, because it's really hard to take anything more punitive or aggressive when it's kind of this nebulous issue. We're also starting to track what are some of the impacts. Do rental properties generate more trash? When we have a lot of rentals in the neighborhood, do we see more issues around our recycling collection, of contamination in our recycling? So these kinds of things that we can start to track. And although you can't do direct correlation, it was from this house, at least we can start to see a correlation in the trends, which will help inform us. Oh, can we charge an additional fee if you're going to be short-term renting to cover those impacts?
I believe Gail had a comment as well. She was trying to talk just a second ago and was cut off.
Thanks, Zach. I don't know. I can't give you anecdotal comments, but I can tell you most of the Aspen homeowner associations in condominium have very specific guidelines for the length of time you can rent. And I could try to give you a list of condominiums that do allow short-term rentals, because many do not. They're very restrictive.
Who is that speaking?
It's Gail.
Okay.
With laryngitis, sorry.
Okay.
So short-term rentals is, we understand that we need to delve into short-term rentals and their impacts on neighborhoods, and to what extent they should or should not be regulated. And we've gotten direction from the Board of County Commissioners to really to get into that topic and come up with some recommendations for standards. And it sounds as though Suzanne, in response to your question about caucuses commenting in their master plans on short-term rentals per se, I would say not yet, in at least in the plans that we have currently adopted, but those plans do address homes and part-time occupancy to some extent. But we really haven't gotten into the topic of short-term rentals in the master plans yet. But I think more and more we'll start to see recommendations coming out of those plans. And yeah, we're going to move forward on some regulations, because it's clearly something we need to get ahead of. So I think the answer to Zach's question is yes. We should be looking at the different types of residential uses we have, and perhaps treating them differently in terms of standards or benefits that need to be addressed relating to those uses. Am I right, Cindy, Zach?
Yeah, my understanding with state law too now is that we have a little more flexibility where the county can look at its own regulations with regard to short-term rental, VRBO types of issues, and You know, it could go anywhere from you need to come for a limited number of those short-term rental slots in the community, anywhere to how much the county can get in terms of any impact fees that would go back to us for our potentially additional services, you know, that we have to be aware of from the sheriff's department, or additional use of county roads, or that sort of thing. So we have some leeway to write criteria and think about those criteria. And it could be a growth management issue. It could be that there's a capacity issue, and neighborhoods think, well, we only want a certain percentage of our neighborhood to be able to do that at any given time. Who knows? So those are all things that we have the ability to start thinking about. If anybody has any thoughts on that, you know, is there a threshold level that makes sense for the community?
And I do want to add that if we create a category that's called residential commercial, this would encompass like all commercial uses. So if a corporation is using it as a corporate retreat, it'd be captured in that as well. VRBOs are getting a lot of attention, but I think we want to create it broad enough that if we do see an unforeseen commercial use happening in these residences, it's captured in that as well. Chris, you had a comment real quick.
Yeah, thanks. I just, it's a really interesting, important conversation. And one thing that it brings up to me that I think could be interesting is hearing from the board, kind of like as more of a starting point, is like hearing from the board on what their intentions kind of towards the short-term rental stock is. Is the goal more to allow second homeowners to, kind of freely use their properties as they see fit when they're not here? Or is it to kind of like open the door to investment style short-term rental management? Or is it to, kind of limit it so that the local rental market isn't so stretched? I think, those look very different in terms of, than how standards and regulations are developed. And so many of the other factors that you're discussing, from affordable housing stock to services might tie into that initial like scoping of like, what is our goal related to this? So I think it would be interesting to like hear from the BOCC on that, and like perhaps that is something that can be informed by the caucuses as well.
Okay, any more on that particular topic, or shall we move, Zach, let's see, to...
Yeah, I just want to, before we move on to the next one, just make sure I sum up these first two to make sure that we've captured what people have said. So I believe what we've heard so far is that there is some merit to having a separate category that would encompass the benefits that we would like to see coming from VRBO or commercial uses of residences, which would also lead to an answer of yes to the first one, where we would get these different benefits from these different categories as well. So a residence coming through growth management that is only being used as a home would not give as many benefits as, say, a VRBO use, which would have to give the benefits to offset the capacity issues there, and that a commercial would have to give those extra benefits as well, the straight up commercial, to balance out the impacts coming from its commercial use. I believe that's what we've heard so far. If I got that wrong, please feel free to correct it.
Zach, can I add sort of that flip to that real quick?
Sure.
This is Mona Newton. Hi. I think maybe also to add, what are the impacts? Cindy mentioned the additional requirements for labor to continue to have that the VRBOs place or require. And so maybe there's that flip. What are the benefits and what are also some of the impacts that come along with the VRBO? And
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
may I just finish real quick?
Sorry. I thought,
I didn't know how he was capturing this stuff, so I'm speaking kind of slowly. I think the other piece is that Bill brought up how a community in the East deals with second homes and the taxation system, and maybe that's something that could be considered in Pitkin County. And I know it's probably hard to tell how much percentage of a time a homeowner spends in their home and whether they, are here 2 weeks a year or 52 weeks out of the year. But that might be a way of dealing with some of these sort of across the board without having to create some special categories and create some differences among, just create some special categories and whatnot, and making your lives more complicated and everybody's lives more complicated.
Yeah, Bill did send, I think we got it out there. Bill sent an article about how Vancouver, I think it was Canada, was dealing with percentage uses of homes and short-term. So hopefully you'll have a chance to read that. Kim, did you have something? Thank you, Mona.
well, the only thing I was thinking is, nothing usually stays the same purpose all the time. You can sometimes rent your house or not rent your house or your second house, or it's just a problem because no one's building something strictly to, usually as a single entity to for one purpose or another, strictly in perpetuity. So I don't know. It's a hard thing. And then when they switch uses, what do you do with the onus that you put on them for being renters? I don't know. I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, I think it's an issue. I don't think, just an example of that is there were many, many people who had second homes here who would never think about renting them, but today do, or the new do. So it's changed that dynamic when ownership changes based on, people's expectations of, why they built here or why they own here.
I think we should, people need to register, which I don't know how much that can be overseen, but, people, but to be registered and treat it like, a tax or something is, I know they were trying to do that in the city. I don't even know, is that happening? Is the city, are they?
Yeah, I think you're taxed. You have a certain business license to be able to do short-term rentals.
And that's as an individual, because if
Right,
people
you have to
are
file.
property management, it's already covered. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to file that. And I'm sure that Chris may know more about this, or someone else on the line might know more about it, but I think you have to file and register, then you pay taxes on that. For the time that you do rent, you pay a certain tax, city tax. But then on top of that, as Gail mentioned, many associations don't allow it or have very strict time requirements about how much you can rent. So it's beyond city or county. When you get into a neighborhood and there's a homeowners association, those often are more restrictive.
Yeah, I think it's often the case that the HOAs hadn't even thought about it, that were written so long ago. Ours, I know in Mountain Valley, is really vague, and we talk about this all the time. And what kind of teeth do you have to enforce, if people are renting short-term all the time or using it as a, I don't know, a corporate retreat. anyway, so that, yeah, it's the individual HOA problem too.
Do you think that a place like Mountain Valley, which is in the county, and it's a neighborhood that has, it's kind of a mix, you know, it's got some transitional spaces, it's got a lot of older homes, long-term residents, as well as some newer places. Do you think that Mountain Valley would want to have
Some direction.
some kind of overall county regulation, or?
I actually do. I mean, because we kind of go around and round about it all the time. And how do we enforce it? And,
Mhm.
you know, just all the problems that come with parking and, yeah, it'd be nice to have some uniformity in the county, I think. I mean, I don't know.
Depends on.
People might. not like that either.
This is fine. I think having some county regulation would be helpful because you have such different opinions and agendas in the neighborhoods that creates that interpersonal conflict,
Right.
which you don't really want with your neighbors. And it would be nice if it was, you know, Big Brother instead, I guess.
Yeah.
So then I'm going to flip what I just answered for those first two questions then, because it's sounding like rather than having a separate categorization for them when they come in to build the building in the first place, it'd be more beneficial for us to just have broad regulations on their uses that address the impacts that come from these short-term rentals, which would address if they switch the use of it, if they decide to do it 1 year, not another year. Is that what we're hearing instead, rather than creating a separate category for this use, just have it as firm regulations going forward?
Yeah, I think so.
Definitely. And I think having almost, I don't know how you would do this, but having some kind of another category that gets assigned, you know, when you decide to start short-terming your house, you somehow enter another category. You're no longer just residential, so that regulations and things can be applied that nobody can say, well, you know, that's arbitrary. You know, my neighbor is a homeowner and, you know, they're allowed to have people parking on the street all night, or where I'm not because I have short-term renters here. I feel like if you could have another definition that you fall under, it would make that easier.
Yeah, I don't know how you'd enforce it on the building end.
Zach, I mean, one thing I see a lot is just, you know, licensing on an annual basis. And, you know, within licensing, you have an opportunity to require, you know, mitigating parking or whatever it is.
Chris, is there any limitation in the city about a threshold level? Say you have 100 residences at any given time, 50% of those could be short-term, or is there anything like that? Any thresholds?
Cindy, honestly, I don't know. I can't answer that with any accuracy. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Thanks for answering.
One of the more interesting regulations I saw was in Steamboat, at least in town, you have to get your neighbor's permission, or they have to sign off. And I feel I'm not sure if it was just in a specific neighborhood in town or if it was in town, but that was when I was like, huh, that's interesting. Sort of
Yeah,
I think the owner to at least attempt to have a positive relationship with their neighbor, which I liked.
Yeah, I mean, there's nice ways to kind of layer the immediate local control, I think, with a broader regulation, again, through the licensing process. You know, I've seen in STR licensing, you have to prove that your HOA or neighborhood authorizes that kind of use. So it starts with kind of, you know, a very localized decision-making and then enters into, you know, some of the broader considerations for licensing.
On the licensing, I think we'll have to check with the attorney's office, just because counties don't get the same licensing authority as municipalities. But it sounds like we want some way to broadly address them, not at the permitting process, but in the actual time of use seems to be where the group is going. Whatever shape that takes, we'll have to check, obviously, with the assessors on the taxation and the attorney's office on the licensing, but whatever avenue is available to us, it seems like the regulations at the time of use and not at the time of construction seems to be where the group is landing on how that should be handled.
Yeah.
Another question, just because this is the question of the day with the board, is how does this new world of different uses of residential look relative to the climate lens? How do we look at that in terms of, you know, the actual measurement of that, or, you know, how do we look at that from our overall resource carrying capacity relative to the things we're looking at in the community? Any thoughts on that?
Cindy, this is Chris. I mean, that goes back to really my initial comment, and that's kind of where that was coming from. You know, if we could hear some like general, if the BOCC and the caucuses could get to some general goals, I think those, you know, take all of the other things into consideration. It's like, what do we want our STR landscape to be? Do we want it to be a total free-for-all? Do we want to create a landscape that incentivizes investors to come here and like eat up all the housing stock and the land? You know, because like that's one direction, and the other direction is extremely limited, and something in the middle is, you know, just kind of like property, you know, like respectful, you know, deference to a property owner to like enjoy use however they see fit. But those put us in really different places, you know, in terms of available housing stock for renters, and all of the other things. So I think that question is like very important to ask.
I just don't know how you measure it. You know, it's such a different thing. Like, is there like with energy, which is hard enough. You know, we looked at an energy budget, if you will, for residential, for residences. And we can look at one house and say, okay, you know, it's got a certain energy budget. And that makes sense in the big scheme of what we're trying to accomplish in climate action. But how do you do that? Is there an overall energy budget with a home as it relates to the various uses? Or maybe not a home, but a commercial enterprise. So I'm not expecting a great answer right now. I'm just saying we do need to think about that and those impacts. And I'm sure there's some research out there that hopefully we can tap into. And Mona and Phi and Chris, you guys might have some resources to help us check into that.
Cindy, I think it would be worth having, and maybe this is not the right time, but if we're gonna, if say we wanted to look at this from a climate lens, I mean, that's a really different way of approaching it in a way, because then you kind of, I don't know if you strip away a lot of the things that we've been talking, like whether it's VRBO or whether it's this or that, and we just look at, well, what are the emissions? What are the goals that we're trying to set? And so that's, I guess that's the budget. So if you have, you know, how 50, I mean, the number that's been sticking in my head is 55,000 people. What is it going to be like to live with 55,000 people in Pitkin County, as opposed to say 17,000, you know, 17, 18,000, a good portion of the year, or probably 6 months out of the year, and then 55,000 over 6 months of the year because of the downtime. And I may not have these numbers right, but if we looked at it completely, if we step back and said, what does it look like from a climate lens? Then that, if everybody could agree that that's the lens we're looking at, because right now it feels like there's a number of different lenses that we're trying to look at, as like impacts on neighborhood and just a lot of different things. But if we said, what does the climate lens look like? We could step back and we could probably create something. It's sort of like REMP, you know, here's the energy consumption budget that you were just talking about, or here's the emissions budget that we're all trying to live within. You can't make people do that, but we can start to set some goals from there, I think. And Yeah, it seems like that might be a further conversation. And then we have to sort of build it out and say, what do we want to be at in 2030 and 2040 and 2050? And I think, what does that look like? But I think this changing landscape really creates shifting ground for us because of the potential that we may have a lot more people living here permanently or more year round, I guess. And maybe that might change when this is all over in a couple of years. Maybe it's going to go back to sort of floating with slow seasons and high seasons and that kind of thing. But right now, I don't know that it feels like we need to plan for a higher level of people living in the valley for a while.
Cindy, one quick thing just to jump in and follow Mona. I do think the question you were asking is kind of a scopable analysis. I know now's not the right time to set that up, but I do think there's a way of answering the question you were asking.
Okay. Great. We're going to have to dig into that, like the overall climate lens of, in general, VRBO, or the overall climate lens of renting short-term.
Suzanne, you unmuted yourself. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I just wanted to say that it seems to me that we're back at that old question again of when are we finished? When do we stop? When do we, what's the ultimate number that we believe through the climate lens or quality of life or overcrowding? When do we finally say that's where we're going to stay? I mean, we can tolerate redevelopment. We're already seeing that there are different impacts with that. But can we ever say, really, I mean, enough? What's the number? If we as I recall talking to Michael Kinsley one time when he was acting as one of the trainers or educators with Leadership Aspen, and he asked of that particular class, what do you think in terms of numbers of people? What is the number of people that you think we could tolerate in this county? What would you be willing to do if you had to finally set the line? And it was scary to hear what some people said. Some people thought 100,000 would be just fine. But how can we ever ultimately envision that, I mean, how can we say stop at any point? Maybe it is not now, but how can we name the number or look again at how many, if everybody in the county right now wanted to max out their use of property, I think that what you have said is there'd be 55,000 people. But if we continue like this and we turn into a town of lodges, every house is a lodge. Can we tolerate that sort of thing?
Global answer for you, but in the theories of carrying capacity, you look at what your carrying capacities are, and you decide what is part of your carrying capacity. And what is recognized more and more and more in the law than it was maybe back in the 70s is that of, what we have to offer relative to water and sewer, what we have to offer in terms of, actually water availability, what we have in terms of capacity to serve in governments. So I think it's a matter of defining what those things are. For me, personally, it's, quality of life issues in terms of, our air quality, our enjoyment of our resources, if every trail is packed to the max and you have to step off to the side every 3 seconds for another person to come by, is that an enjoyable experience? You know, those are the types of quality of life things that are a little harder to get to. Maybe not air quality, maybe not water, because we have measurement tools today. But zoning is our authority to set limitations to the number of sticks and bricks homes and commercial storage. And so that's kind of long-winded answer. There are a number of elements to look at. Not, you know, it's how much can we serve, and shouldn't our zoning be equal to what we can serve and accept in terms of serving? Because various districts will tell you, water districts or sewer districts or police districts or fire districts are going to tell you, we have a limitation to what we can serve, you know, because there's going to be a gag factor on taxation, if you will, to be able to grow those districts' capacity. So, you know, we're seeing it throughout the community where there's a need for additional fire district stations throughout a district because it's hard to get out past the roundabout to serve things that are on the other side of the roundabout. So we need a fire station out there, or we need, you know, various lift stations for water or sewer or whatever it might be. So I think, you know, we're just seeing more and more of a request for services to grow.
But
May I step in?
Yep.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just about to call.
It's all right. I agree with Suzanne. I mean, where do we stop? And that's one reason I was interested in being a member or getting involved with the growth management outreach. I wanted to bring up something that we all talk about managing growth, and yet our city council is considering adding 216 to 501 more affordable housing units at the lumber yard. And does Aspen need this many more units, along with the 45 being completed right now? Won't this add another 1,000 people and more traffic to Aspen's population? And there's got to be a point here where we quit building and building and building, and we just keep adding more and more. And where is it where we're going to lose our quality of life? And the, like you said, the roundabout, Cindy, is getting to be ridiculous. Trying to get people out of town, it's backed up. I'm in town, but it's backed up for 2 miles. And it's not at all like it was 30 some years ago when I got here. And we just keep adding and adding and adding. And shouldn't there be some type of stoppage here? I mean, I don't know that. And you say zoning, but zoning doesn't seem to matter. It seems like every time there's a piece of property available, the city wants to scarf it up to put in more affordable housing. I'm not against affordable housing, even though it might seem like I am, because I actually live within the affordable housing. It just that one of the reasons for moving here from a big city is because of the quality of life and the trails, which you mentioned too, Cindy, which used to be able to just go on and not see people. But anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Susan and Zach and I had gone back with Susan had some questions about affordable housing. We have since put the regional affordable housing study on the website, and you can see where that is. And there's some very interesting statistics about the Aspen area or the Aspen metro area, Aspen snowmass. I think I quoted like page 21 or something of that study as a summary. And the real question here, I think, Zach, we're starting to jump into some of the questions that I had after my narrative. And it was just like, how much, where, all of those questions. And my thought on this question to everyone is, Yeah, is there a limit to how much, and what is that balance within it? You know, if we are creating jobs, which we are at a rate of about, I think it's either 1.2 or 1.6% per year in the general Aspen Snowmass area, where do those people live? Where should they live? What are, you know, what's really the dynamic here when you're looking at a service industry, which is what we are, and what we face with lower income levels for the service area employee at around $54,000 or $56,000 a year for that household. You know, where could they expect to be able to live and still service us? And what services then are put upon the community if that person is not living near their work? We are today subsidizing transportation, you know, housing, a lot of things that are subsidized because of the wage and the inability for those workers to otherwise be close enough to their jobs. So a question is there a limit on how much, and what's that balance within it? And so if you went to my narrative, it really talks about the original thoughts about growth management were a balance in all those sectors. It was a balance in residential, it was a balance in commercial, and a balance in lodging. And today, as we know, lodging looks different because housing can be lodging. And so it's a little out of whack. And then what numbers and what resetting of that balance should we be addressing today, I guess? What do you guys as community members have the appetite for? You know, are we looking at a rebalance? And again, I have to remind us that we are, while we all work together with the city of Aspen, you know, what we're talking about here is the Pitkin County unincorporated growth management system. And we certainly can try to work with the city, Snowmass, Basalt to, you know, collaborate and try to get the balance we're talking about. But we are today, and we are really only talking about the authority to look at the unincorporated Pitkin County in our growth management system. But what does that look like? You know, we are committed at this point to certain land use patterns, which are to put that affordable housing close to the jobs so that we reduce the amount of traffic back and forth, the air quality issues, and it creates more of the density issues so it's always a trade-off. So I want everybody else to talk and say what you think about that.
I mean, Cindy, you know that I wrote about, you know, my feelings about the oversight of the housing authority. And I don't know, am I the only one that thinks that we just need more accountability? Instead of just building more housing, there just seems to be rampant abuse of where people are living and how they get in there and how they stay in there. And, you know, maybe I'm off the wall, but I just don't know if anybody thinks now that it's going to get computerized, if we're going to have a better system. Because, you know, do we really need as much as cropping up? I don't know.
Well, those are definitely, I mean, if we have trust in our systems is huge. You know, if we don't, then there's a lot that we need to work on there. But as far as just the pure numbers go, the numbers of jobs that we have and households that we have, I think that report really does a good job of explaining that and what the needs are and what the gaps are in terms of those numbers. Now, whether or not they're filled correctly, that's a whole nother topic. And yes, we all need to have accountability. But there's a lot of great numbers to look at in there. And I'm sorry off the top of my head, Susan, I wrote them out for you, and I think Zach did as well, what those numbers are right now, with what the determined gap is.
The gap in Aspen snowmass area is 2,100 units. Whether that is because affordable housing is being abused and not being used the way it's intended, that's not assessed in that report, because if they knew, I'm sure they'd close that gap. But that is currently what it is. It's projected to be about 3,500 by 2027 at the current rate that we are at now.
Okay, so
3,500.
it seems like,
I'm sorry.
I don't know if I'm on, am I muted?
So you're talking.
Well, it just seems like that's a lot. And if people, when they quit working for in Aspen or Snowmass or wherever, they continue with their units, and then we just keep building more units every 10 years after they retire from working. So I don't know what the situation is. It seems like we're just going to keep building thousands and thousands more because no one ever leaves. Is that true or not? What can be done about that? I mean, they're supposed to be for employees who are working, but then they quit after 10 years or however long, and then they stay there. So then we have to build that many more. Any answers?
Lines within the housing authority, there are guidelines, and thus far the housing authority has chosen to put, an age limit on how long you have to work, at least 30 hours a week for 9 months out of the year, as the categories. And to tell you the truth, I'm not really sure today if that's you have to work to 65 or 67 to still qualify to be in the housing. But when you retire within those guidelines, then there is not a requirement that you move. That's how it is today. And you're correct that a certain percentage of that housing will not be available for the workforce.
And thanks, Susan. Yeah, those are questions that you've raised on a couple of meetings, and they're really critical to how affordable housing functions in the overall system, and something that we need to look into moving forward. But I don't know that we'll resolve the affordable housing question today, but all good points. Thanks.
But I think the big question, or the big broad thing that we need to try to grapple with is, is there an ultimate limitation, like Suzanne brought up and like Susan brought up? Are there ultimate limitations that this group feels are necessary from a growth perspective? And that gets into looking at all kinds of things, jobs created, to go along with, what we have the capacity to serve.
And there's physical carrying capacity and quality of life as it relates to carrying capacity, and they don't always meet up at the same place, but they're both factors that need to be considered. And sometimes you can actually have endless physical capacity, but you get to a point where quality of life is no longer attainable if you're simply relying on a physical capacity. So yeah, so there's a lot to consider there.
So real quick, I just want to, we will be coming back to this question, not just at the end of this meeting, but over and over again throughout the process. When we talk about land use pattern and growth patterns next week, that directly touches on the topics that you're talking now. We're also going to try and give some time after Cindy gives her presentation. I just want to make sure that we get everything covered real quick. We did have one more question on this that was outstanding, directly relating to the community benefits that the growth management system is supposed to be providing. which is, do we allow mitigation instead of standards? Do we allow a mixture of both? And just to clarify real quick, mitigation is if people can pay for the impacts that they're impacted, that are occurring in the community because of the development. And I believe Cindy can probably elaborate on that a lot better than I can.
Well, I think that we've been talking about it. Are there limits? And you just say, no, you can't do beyond that. Or do you allow people to pay their way, if you will? Say there's an air quality issue by adding additional development. Do you allow for a REMP type payment, a renewable energy mitigation type payment, or a air quality mitigation type payment, where then that payment goes into a bucket where then the community has to figure out how to mitigate that impact, versus saying, no, we can't allow that impact because we no longer know how to mitigate it. I think affordable housing is a great example. Where do we mitigate? Where, and Susan brought it up, the city's trying as hard as it can to meet the obligation. It gets housing mitigation fees from development, and then it goes out to try to mitigate and build the housing. And a lot of people are saying, hey, there's no more room here. So mitigation is an offset of whatever the issue is. And either we allow it to be paid, or we create standards that say, maybe you can't do that because we have no more place to put affordable housing, as an example. So that's what that one means.
I think also another part of the standard could be, you can't mitigate by putting affordable housing somewhere else. You have to put it on the parcel where that employment is being generated. Would be another way that could also become reality.
Or buy down existing housing within the community to create a better balance. There are a number of techniques that could be used to offset.
Cindy, this is Chris. One thing, I don't have this like fully baked out yet, but that just the past kind of 20 minutes of conversation or so got me thinking about telecommuting, kind of in the context of, regionalizing the development of workforce housing. And obviously like workforce housing, a lot of the intent is, to keep folks in their community, but also to help folks be close to their jobs, and then, mitigate travel demand and VMT and all those kind of things. As we kind of like regionalize the workforce housing stock a bit, what if folks who were developing commercial projects were incentivized to create telecommuting options that, allowed maybe the workforce housing to be developed where it was a good fit, and kind of spread around the valley strategically to avoid, overwhelming any particular area. And then, people could work where they live, like work in the community they lived in, while still having a job for, whatever company it was in whatever part of the valley. And maybe
that works except in the service industry, because
yeah, totally. I think, of course, it's not going to work for every industry, but there are a fair amount of people still commuting for a desk job that happens to be going pretty well, working remotely right now. I think it's really important for people to be connected to the communities that they're working in. I think of city and county employees, if you never come to Aspen and you work for the city, that there's a fair amount of disconnect, but it doesn't have to be every day of the week. So I don't know, maybe there's something there in the incentivization system that, can help alleviate some pressures and distribute workforce housing.
I think that Chris, I think that is great, and it probably relates more to within the city jobs coming to sticks and bricks locations versus what the county really sees more of, because most of our impacts come from residential. We don't have a ton of commercial, but is the management and maintenance of residential, which is a lot of hands-on, property management type work. But yeah, I think that's a good thought when we look at potentially commercial and parts of households that maybe don't have to be there all the time.
So real quick, Sam, you have your hand up. Please feel free to jump in.
So yes, just hearing some of the other comments, I think a lot of these pressures go back to general population increase worldwide, nationwide. We're in a desirable area, right? There's never going to be, well, I shouldn't say never. There's probably not a likely scenario where we become an undesirable area to the pressure for people to want to move here or spend time here. I think I'm personally generally opposed to allowance of mitigation. I think a lot of my personal philosophies go back to how do we embrace, regenerative design? How do we address the resource use? I struggle a little bit with loss of property rights. Not sure how that would work, right? It's like all these people that own property that we're talking about are just like all of us on this call. We have rights. How I think the planners on the call probably have more experience with how downzoning works and what kind of pushback would occur from the people who are affected by that, which could also be some of the people on this call and or their clients. So I think that's something that needs to be examined pretty closely and determine how that works. I, can't say that I completely understand it, but those are my initial comments on what's occurring here. So, affordable housing, I think there's a lot of planning for parking that goes on with the affordable housing. And I think that, I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but it's like, if you're living in affordable housing, maybe you don't need 2 parking spaces. Maybe you should take the bus. Those projects need to be carefully planned with where they're located. They should be near transit hubs. They should be walkable, bikeable, busable. Because I think that, what I see with the lumberyard in particular, right? You're losing a commercial resource for a lot of the people in the community here, both residents and people who work, and then you're putting 300 units there, and you're going to allow parking. And what's going to happen there is that parking is going to overflow into the business center, which is also experiencing some pressure related to the loss of business use. So you're pushing businesses elsewhere in favor of affordable housing. And, I can't argue that we need affordable housing. We need people that work here. The trend is that we are losing housing stock through a variety of reasons. And we need people who work here or even work close by, right? It's like even Down Valley is becoming unaffordable. We can't rely on nearby communities to house the people who work here. So yeah, I think that's generally what I have to share.
Thanks, Sam. It sounds like, there is a struggle. You want people to have rights, but on one level, you're acknowledging or saying that we have limits and you can't mitigate everything.
So just to make sure we're on track, we can probably continue this for 5 more minutes or so, and then Cindy is going to be giving us a quick presentation. And then if we have time at the end, we'll be more than happy to jump into this discussion again. But If anybody has any further comments, please feel free to jump in now. Go ahead, Suzanne.
As far as mitigation goes, I think that we've grown too old, too fat, too tall, too big, too much of everything to now continue to play the mitigation game. Once there, I think it made sense, but especially because more and more and more, we are dealing with people who want to mitigate by just turning their money over and letting somebody else figure out how it's going to be done. There's no end to it of, what people, the amount of money that some people have to just hand to the county to mitigate the problems that they are or impacts that they're having. So I think we've outgrown that. I think for a time it worked, but I think it needs to be vastly reduced now. And then the other question the other thought that I have is there we're trying to measure a number of things in terms of quantity and also quality of life. Quantity in terms of water or services or things that can be quantified. Could we start looking at that? What are the things that we can quantify? Because the placing a number on something is a lot easier for us than deciding whether I think that 50 people on a trail is way too many and other people in the community might think it's just fine and dandy. Is there a way that we can, what are the things that we can quantify? I mean, just put a number on it. And you don't have to answer it right now, but maybe that would be another place to stand to look at things for starters.
I'm sure that some studies have been done on that. I'll do some research and see if we can get back to the group with whatever I can find throughout the process. Tim, do you have a comment you'd like to make? You appeared on my screen all of a sudden.
Tim, you're muted.
Oh, it looks like you don't have your audio set up. So if you want to comment, we'll get back to you. Just so you know, next to the little microphone on your control is a caret. If you click on that caret, it'll give you your options on how to connect your input. You can also comment in the chat if you would like. Oh, you can't hear either. Okay. Well, if anybody else has a comment that they would like to make right now, please feel free to jump in, or we can move into the presentation real quick and come back to the discussion after Cindy has given her presentation.
Are you going to bring up the questions? Okay.
Do you want I thought you wanted the growth matrix, but if you want, I can bring up the questions.
Yeah, actually, the growth matrix and the questions. Maybe we start with the questions.
Sure. Once you can start, and I'll get all that stuff pulled up.
Okay. On the website, or I think in your invite, you got the packet. And what I tried to do, because there are a number of people who I think rightly so didn't really understand or haven't really dug into growth management in the past. And so what I tried to do is write a little elevator speech, 3-minute elevator speech about what I would say growth management is and where we are today. So I'm not going to go over that again. It's in your packet, in your invite, and on our website. But basically, we've had certain limitations in the past, and we've allowed, we're getting into a whole nother area of growth management and discussion right now in that, I don't know if you remember, but in our first meeting, we looked at what was called the anatomy of the land use code. And the anatomy of the land use code showed, hey, we have master plans that inform our growth management system and what we need to do, the values that we have and what we're trying to capture, and some of the benefits that we've gone over and prioritized already. What do those look like? And as part of that whole ecosystem of code, if you will, we have a relief valve from growth management. Growth management was meant to be the hammer that all new development needed to go through. In 1978, when it was created, there were a certain number of previously approved lots out there. Those did not get affected by the growth management system. But if you wanted to come in and create new lots, then you had to go through the growth management system if you wanted to subdivide property. Or if you wanted today, in today's growth management system, if you want to add square footage, then you have to, beyond what is a minimum growth management square footage of 5,050 square feet for a house, then you have to go through the growth management process. Or the other part we're getting into today that we haven't talked about before are the exemptions. And those exemptions are things that I think we're gonna have to dig into a little bit more to talk about. You can be exempt from growth management if you do something like buy a transferable development right, which has other qualities and things that the community would like to achieve, like preservation of the more rural areas of the county or the more remote areas of the county that we've zoned rural and remote. So if you buy a development off of that land, then it can be relocated, it can be transferred to become either a new development right within the urban growth boundary or additional square footage elsewhere throughout the county. And so that's an exemption from growth management. Other exemptions from growth management allow us to do things like if in your development of subdividing, you can preserve additional land than what's required as minimum under the land use code. So we've got a bunch of exemptions from growth management. Again, we need to familiarize ourselves with a little bit more and determine whether or not those are the exemptions that we still want to see today under our land use code. Are they still the values, or is there a different way to get there? Or have we already gotten there in some cases and we can call it good and not require those exemptions? Or are exemptions too great a price to pay or not enough? Are they just a form of mitigation that we don't want to see any longer? So those are things that we have, we have to question in our system today. And I know Zach's got a whole way of explaining the code that, Zach, we may want to look at that now versus getting into these questions, because I think we've got so much to do that what Zach has created is another way of looking at the land use code and the growth management system in a more succinct way than that diagram we have on the website called the anatomy of the code. So here's another visual for you to kind of go over what I just did talk about. So Zach, if you want to talk about that for a minute, then I think we're sort of running out of time. I don't, unfortunately.
We've got about 25 minutes left. So we just wanted to make sure that there was a firm understanding of how the current growth management system works in Pitkin County. So essentially what happens is an applicant submits their application to the planning department, and then they have to determine if they fall under one of the current exemptions, so they don't have to go through our growth management quota system, which is what we fondly refer to as GMQS. The first big exemption that most people are familiar with are TDRs. So each TDR is worth 2,500 additional square footage. So If they get 4 of them, they can build up to the maximum house size to 15,000. They can buy one and only use part of it. It's really up to them how they wish to use it. And then that return benefit that we get from that is that 35 acres of land that's now conserved as rural remote. So it's a way of pushing development from the backcountry into areas where we'd like to see it. So it's a form of controlling where development is going, essentially, which is why it's determined to be an exemption. The other thing it can be used for is a new development right in the urban growth boundary, which we refer to as the UGB. A new development right here is if they have a parcel and they want to split it into 2 smaller parcels, they need to apply for the development right for that new parcel that's being created so that a house can be built upon that. If they don't get that, then that new parcel isn't allowed to have anything constructed on it. Another way that Cindy phrases exemptions that I really like is you can think of all of these as incentives for something we wish to reward. So in this case, the reason we're rewarding TDRs is because we're preserving our backcountry, which is why it's an exemption. The next one is pre-existing square footage. So if they tear down a 14,000 square foot house and wish to build straight back up to that 14,000, they don't need TDRs and they don't need to go through our growth management system. If they want to go past the 14,000, then they'll have to either buy a TDR or apply through GMQS for additional square footage to go past it. But they have that existing property right from what was already approved for that parcel. So that is an exemption. The next one is deed restricted dwelling units. However, this is only for public entities. So this is not an exemption for a private use. This is only if a public entity wishes to create deed restricted dwelling units. That is obviously because we want to allow for the housing of employees. Preservation of historic structures, they have a small exemption. I don't believe it's the full, they can build up to the max, but they're allowed to build up to a certain amount of square footage if they're preserving a historical building on that parcel. 500-acre parcels. So if it's 500 acres or larger, they are allowed to build up to 15,000 square feet on that. And that is a reward because it's another way of preserving a large amount of space in our rural area. So that was a reward that was deemed allowable. In the low impact residential zone, so this residential zone only exists in Brush Creek and Owl Creek. They're next to Buttermilk. They are allowed to build up to 8,250 square feet without having to go through our growth management system. Agricultural uses in the conservation. So PUD is a planned unit development. That essentially means that a lot of other development standards are applied beyond just what are listed in the original zoning. And so this is a particular zone that's designed for agricultural uses and conservation of that land. And so they're allowed some exemptions from growth management for agricultural uses on that parcel. On any zone, on any parcel in the county, they're allowed to build up to 5,750 square feet. The only exception to this is in the Frying Pan Caucus, where they're only able to get that if, I think it's, Ellen, feel free to correct me, I believe it's about 1,000 square feet for a garage, and then the other rest of it is for their main residence. I might not be getting those numbers exact, but you're allowed to build up to 5,700 square feet.
Sorry, the caucus requested in that area that they can build a 4,000 square foot house and a 1,700 square foot outbuilding or garage or another structure. And yeah, okay, thanks.
And so that exemption still exists there, but they've gone further to specify how that exemption square footage can be used. Civic or institutional use, this is exempt from growth management. So if the hospital wants to build a building, they're exempt because that's a civic or institutional use. So the village residential and the village commercial zones exist only in Redstone, and this exemption only applies to a new development right in those zones. They don't need to go through growth management. ANCI are accessible units for handicapped, like units essentially, are exempt from growth management. Change in use of a building is exempt. A minor expansion of a multifamily unit And then the last one is very specifically sized greenhouses and very specific parcels are exempt. I'm not going to go into the details now. There's a lot of language associated with it. But what I really wanted to illustrate here is that we have quite a few exemptions to our growth management system. So this is one of the reasons I said earlier in one of our meetings that only 10 to 15% of houses actually go through our growth management system. And that's because we've got all of these exemptions that we've determined incentivize something that we wish to see in the county. If an application does not fit under any of these exemptions, then they begin to go through the GMQS process. This process begins by them being scored on the merits and the community benefits provided by that proposed project. Once it's been scored, it's presented to the Planning and Zoning Board, along with all of the other applications that year going through the growth management quota system. The scoring allows for them to be compared next to each other, kind of an apples to apples comparison, to determine which one merits being awarded the new development right, being awarded the new square footage. And so there's an annual allotment associated with these, depending on whether they're in the rural, the urban growth boundary, or whether it's an addition. And so that allotment is supposed to determine, that's the pacing part of it. So if there's 6 applications that go beyond that allotment, only 4 will be awarded because the other would have exceeded the allotment annually. And that's how we are supposed to pace growth. Whether that this very rarely happens of late. We haven't hit our allotment maximum in many, many years. Once planning and zoning has approved the projects based on the scoring of them and determined what they are recommending each one should be awarded, it's presented to the Board of County Commissioners, who then also make a determination on which projects have the most merit based on the scoring and the community benefits provided by them, and determines how much square footage they're going to be awarded. A new development right can be awarded either that minimum 5750 or anything beyond that was applied for that the board has deemed necessary. And then additional square footage can be awarded up to the maximum of 15,000 square feet on a particular parcel, assuming zoning allows for that maximum construction being built. It was for perpetuity. However, this summer, the board passed some modifications to the growth management system that has made it so that after 5 years, additional square footage will expire if it has not been submitted for permitting before that time has expired. And new development right, if they were approved for say 8,000 square feet, if they haven't submitted for a permit by the end of that 5 years, it drops down to that 5,750 square feet. So that never expires, but anything past that will expire. And then upon submittal for a permit, they have to give us the community benefits that they promised when the allotment was given to them. So if they said they were going to build a new bus stop, before they are allowed to have a permit issued for that new building, they have to have actually submitted and constructed that new bus stop. So I know that was pretty quick. There's a lot of information in there, but we just wanted to give you that quick overview of how the growth management system actually works. And I really think the big things that are to be taken out of this that are going to really tie into our next conversations are the number of exemptions and what the exemptions are for. The community benefits are one way to get something that we want out of our growth management system, but the exemptions are also an immensely powerful tool to get the community benefits that we want as well. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cindy.
If you look at my narrative, it just kind of goes through the fact that the exemptions have become more popular than the actual competition. And applicants find it easier to go straight to an exemption, and therefore we have less competition, and the competition is less robust, and we're getting less out of the growth management system. So there's a lot of questions there that, Zach, if you don't mind bringing those questions up, that we can talk about, that will kind of fold back into our discussion. I don't think we have a ton of time left today to talk about them, but at the bottom of my short elevator speech narrative, Is growth management necessary today? Do we reset the land use standards or put limitations on house size and pacing and climate action regulations? And do we just say, hey, we're going to zone it like we mean it, and we're not going to have mitigation? Or in other words, structure the zoning code to allow only what is deemed desirable in the community? So a little bit back to that mitigation question. Do we reset the land use code exemptions and or standards and force a more robust competition and growth management? Perhaps even eliminating some of those exemptions in order to get more competition and less avenues for development without the competition. Or do we reshape the growth management criteria and just call it good? Do we have that list that Ellen showed us earlier to work through in terms of benefits and say, hey, let's just get new types of benefits and go from there? So where we are today is this group is deliberating all of that. And we really, really, really appreciate all your time and thought and energy into these questions. And we'll be taking what comes out of this and filling out a matrix that that Zach brought up earlier that's going to provide us with some kind of over and over, letting us go back and refine in these next 5 weeks, letting us refine what this group wants to take forward as recommendations to the P&Z and the Board of County Commissioners. In that matrix that you all have, the growth management matrix that's on the website and you've received earlier, and also we're going to bring up here, I think in just a second, with that matrix, we're going to start filling that out. But you can also see what information we've gleaned so far from the Board of County Commissioners feedback and your planning and zoning commissioners feedback, some staff observations, and then we're going to fill in what this group has to say. So it's a lot, but I think we've organized it in a way that we can start to walk through it a little bit. We threw a lot of information at you at the end, but hopefully it was understandable. But are there any big questions, anything we need to clarify in these last 15 minutes? Did we totally confuse everything?
I did want to say thank you to all of you for these last 4 meetings. I know they haven't probably been as vigorous a discussion as many people were expecting, but we really wanted to make sure that we had a solid platform set up before we jumped into these nitty-gritty details, and that the next few conversations coming up are going to be pretty in-depth and really have substantive impacts on what the future of our county are going to look like.
Are there any clarifying points, or anybody want to talk about, do they just need to absorb all the information, think about it? And we'll start next week. We hope to next week talk a little bit about some of these topic areas relative to where we want to go, and also bring up a couple of foundational issues in terms of the land use patterns that we see are in the code today. Basically, the code today sets up a land use pattern of having more density in the urban growth boundary areas, more uses that are associated with work-related issues, commercial and affordable housing within the urban growth boundaries, and pretty much feathers out in terms of density as you go further out into the rural parts of Pitkin County. There are a lot of pockets of Pitkin County that were developed prior to zoning, and some that took advantage of a 35-acre parcelization prior to growth management being enacted. And so we don't have a pure land use pattern in the county, but where the county's zoning has been able to be applied, it's pretty much more intensity in the urban growth boundaries and less intensity in the rural parts of the county, and then even less intensity in the more remote parts of Pitkin County on the edges of national forest or Bureau of Land Management properties. So that's the generalized land use pattern. We want to talk to this group about whether or not there's confirmation that that's still a good pattern to aspire to in our zoning, or whether or not we need to take a look at whether or not that pattern needs some adjustment as we look at what we're trying to achieve with the growth management system. So those are some tee-ups for where we're going to be in the next meeting next week on Thursday.
And if anybody has any additional information that you would like, if there's something in particular you would like to see covered, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to make sure we get you that information or that we cover that topic.
We have about 9 minutes if anybody wants to talk about anything, where we are today, or additional information you feel like you need, things that you feel like we haven't answered adequately, or any observations. Okay. Well, John, did you want to say anything, or are you just kind of getting on?
No, I've been just patiently listening. I had a couple of things. I hope I can tie them all together. First thing I wanted to mention was, I guess, while we're talking about carrying capacity, and there's really so many unknowns with this pandemic, because firsthand experience, I've experienced the worst traffic ever of all time, just trying to get to the roundabout just a couple days ago. I noticed that there were a lot of private jets that they've been here all summer. And is there a way we can get that information from the airport to see how big of a component private air traffic is compared to years prior? Another thing I've noticed just from a personal standpoint is 2 separate properties have gone on the market up in my neighborhood in Little Annie Basin just in the last couple of weeks. I think that's an indicator as to the way things are going. And I wanted to comment on, I didn't get the gentleman's name, but he was talking about downzoning and so on and so forth. And I just want to say, having participated in the downzoning of Little Annie Basin, I think it's pretty obvious that downzoning can work and work very well. I know a lot of people will complain about it, but it's a look at what is really the right way to develop a property. I mean, in this particular case, Little Annie, it's it's up at a high elevation and you can't drive there year round. And so 1,000 square feet makes perfect sense. Otherwise you're going to be building something that's a huge energy consumer, and it's exactly what we don't want, especially as a progressive mountain community. Anyway, so that's, I guess, really all I have to say at the moment. Probably think of something as soon as I get off, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I know a lot of the school teachers are worried about school enrollment mean, whether schools are in-person classes or offline, they're just, the teachers that I know are really concerned about what's going to happen and if enrollment is going to be through the ceiling. So thanks, and see you next week.
Thanks, John. We'll try to get some of that data. We're keeping track of some of it on a newly formed dashboard. We're trying to keep track of traffic, some air quality, some flushes, and some energy use patterns. And I just want to let everybody know that I think it's scheduled for now 1 o'clock on July 21st. The board is going to get an update on job from the Job Center of Colorado, as well as an update from Gabe Preston, who we're working with on that dashboard, and he's done some preliminary population of that data. So if you wanted to watch the board meeting on July 21st at 1 o'clock, we're going to have a little bit more explanation on that dashboard. So it'll be Tuesday before our Thursday meeting, and it might be helpful for you to listen in on that if you're interested in some of that data. All right, everybody, thank you so much for your dedication to this process. I think we heard a lot of consensus on the priorities. We heard a lot of feedback on limitations versus mitigation, and different ways of looking at different types of commercial, residential, and part-time commercial residential uses. So we've got a lot of devil in the details on how we move forward with all of that. So thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.